Hi folks, we're just letting everyone into the webinar right now. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, it's 2:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started while a few more people file in. Thank you for joining this week's Virtual Biodiversity Without Boundaries webinar. This week we are going to hear from a variety of speakers on key biodiversity areas, connecting conservation, science, policy, and action. Before I hand it over to the speakers, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. We are recording this meeting, and the recording will be available on our website for anyone that wants to view it. As we go through the presentations, we're going to save questions until the end for this webinar, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and when possible, if you could direct your question to a speaker using their name so that we know who should answer it. We may answer it by typing back to the attendee during the webinar. If we do that, the written record of the meeting will be available on our website as well, so you can see that afterwards. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A. I do want to say that this is our second to last Virtual Biodiversity Without Boundaries webinar. We'll be taking the next 2 weeks off, and then on July 9th, we'll hear from NatureServe President and CEO Sean O'Brien, with an update on NatureServe and how we are looking forward to the next steps as an organization. So look for a registration email for that. And so I think that's it for me. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Healy Hamilton, who's NatureServe's Chief Scientist. She will be leading and moderating this panel today. Over to you, Healy.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks to each and every one of you who has chosen to spend some time this afternoon attending Virtual BWB and hearing from 3 extraordinarily accomplished speakers who today are going to share with us their experience about key biodiversity areas and the data behind them, the challenges and opportunities of identifying and delineating them. And I'm going to start with a very brief introduction of just what key biodiversity areas are. And I'm hoping that all of you who are listening today can sort of view this whole session through the lens of key biodiversity areas as a potential unifying theme for the entire NatureServe network. So throughout the history of conservation and efforts to prioritize conservation, there have been so many different approaches to how do we identify those areas that are the most important to conserve. A huge diversity of approaches in the academic literature. Those have spilled over into approaches in the more popular science literature. We've heard of important bird areas, important plant areas, Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, amphibian survival sites, biodiversity hotspots. There are a huge array of ways that we can say a certain place is important for a certain species for us to protect. And pretty soon, the whole planet is covered by something that's important to someone. And this is a relatively challenging situation for people on the receiving end of this information to respond to, where we have government and policymakers and developers who are asking us to please speak with a unified voice about what areas are most important. So at the World Conservation Congress in Bangkok in 2004, there was a resolution that requested the IUCN Species Survival Commission to figure this out, to agree to a methodology by which countries could identify key biodiversity areas, drawing on existing data sets that are global efforts. So the idea of KBAs is that they are in fact an umbrella framework, right, that harmonizes existing approaches from important plant areas and bird areas and hotspots, right? All the different approaches, are there ways that we can harmonize them? And KBAs are in fact that effort, which came about after years of very public consultation. So the KBA standards were years in the making. Sort of the definition of a KBA are sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. Their intention is to harmonize existing approaches, to be very democratically identified and delineated by a whole national coordinating committee, and we will hear more about Canada's efforts in just a few minutes, to be taxonomically diverse, to have clear boundaries, but very importantly, KBAs are not formal protected areas necessarily. Governments can take steps to do so, but they are guiding. They are not a formal protected area yet. And it's really meant to help all kinds of stakeholders understand, what does the conservation community, speaking in one voice, think about, or what does it say about where are the places we need to focus our efforts? So there are 5 main KBA criteria that were determined over the course of 10 years of consultations. So threatened species, right? Not a surprise that those would be important. And of course, the NatureServe Network has a lot of data to help meet this criterion. Threatened ecosystems. So that's a sort of an advance beyond things like the Endangered Species Act, which are so species focused. We can think of what ecosystems are threatened as well. Geographically restricted biodiversity, whether they're individuals or co-occurring, or whether they're assemblages, or whether they're ecosystems, right? High geographic restriction is an important criterion. Ecological integrity, right? Something that NatureServe has been active in quantifying for a very long time, right? So ecological integrity is one of the criteria for determining an important site. And then biological processes, right? So demographic aggregations or refugia or really important sources of recruitment for the next generation. Those are also considered the 4th criterion. And then finally, irreplaceability, right? So quantitative analyses that help us understand where the most important sites are for conservation. And in fact, the Map of Biodiversity Importance Project, though not all the way through to a formal irreplaceability analysis, is an essential input into something like that. So The KBA partnership, that is the 13 conservation organizations that together sort of guide and lead and advance KBAs, whether that's developing the data that are underlying it, whether it's leading trainings to support national and regional KBA identification and delineation, right? There are all kinds of elements that we need to move KBAs forward, and this is the partnership that that currently does that, of which we are a member, and I am the representative. And but many people on staff have been involved in KBAs, and Pat Comer and Dawn Faber-Langendoen in particular have been important in advancing all of this. One thing I failed to say, I'm sorry, is that all of these criteria have quantitative thresholds. My apologies, I mistake. So there are quantitative thresholds behind all of these, and that lends our existing data to be applied using those thresholds to identify and delineate KBAs. So today we are going to hear from the current experience in Canada. We're going to hear from Christopher Tracey, who serves on the technical working group for the KBA partnership, and from Pat Comer about applying the KBA standard in the United States, which is something we've discussed quite a bit over the years. And then also we're very fortunate to have the executive director of EcoCiencia, Dr. Carmen Josse, who used to work at NatureServe, to talk about her work in the tropical Andes. So with that, I would like to pass it off to Dr. Ciara Raudsepp-Hearne. I will stop sharing my screen and pass it off to Ciara.
Thank you very much, and I will try to share the right screen.
Great. Thank you, Ciara.
So you're seeing my first slide. Okay. Thank you very much for that great introduction. So we are going to very briefly explain to you what we've been doing in Canada. We've been working on this in earnest for about a year, although there was some upfront work by Justina Ray and Stephen Woodley, people who are also involved in the KBA partnership at the global scale, to prepare the ground in Canada to do this work. So we have quite a strong mandate in Canada to identify and delineate key biodiversity areas. We're both signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity, where Target 11 particularly wants us to conserve 17% of terrestrial land and focus on areas that are important for biodiversity. The Government of Canada has been focusing on that particular target. In Canada, they've called it Target 1, and there's a pathway to Target 1 working group and national steering committee, and it's all of the provinces and territories and other indigenous groups are involved in this, and they recognize key biodiversity areas explicitly as a quality element in trying to achieve Target 11, or in their case Target 1. And the recommendation is that all jurisdictions in Canada apply the global IUCN Key Biodiversity Area Standard to identify these areas that are particularly significant to biodiversity. And the reason that they have found this to be a very intriguing tool is for all the reasons that Healy presented to us very succinctly, that this is an umbrella tool that captures all sorts of different approaches. It's also very standardized. So it's, as Healy mentioned also, it's a quantitative tool. There are quantitative thresholds. Things either are or they're not a key biodiversity area. So it doesn't really matter who does the work. They either meet the standard and those thresholds or they don't. So the way that we've organized it in Canada, we have put together a national coordination group. We have a number of mostly NGOs who are involved in that national coordination group. WCS Canada, NatureServe Canada, and Birds Canada are really the core members who are doing a lot of the work, but there are growing numbers of other organizations, plus Environment and Climate Change Canada, so the federal government, and members of provincial and territorial governments and Indigenous communities who are also involved at different scales in doing this work. But I'm going to explain to you a little bit how we've regionalized it because of the complexity of the jurisdictional landscape in Canada. So a lot of land use decisions are made at the provincial or territorial scale. And so while we're trying to do this in a sort of a top-down way, that wouldn't be very effective in the long term. So we're meeting that with a more regional approach. We are in constant communication with the global program because this is a new tool and there are very complete guidelines to go along with the standard. But in fact, we are among the first countries that are testing it out in a very large way. So we are finding, all sorts of questions and things that could be improved upon and testing out what they're doing. And in fact, there's already a second set of guidelines that are coming out very soon. So there's a management committee, we have Secretariat, and then we have these core partners who are doing the actual work of identifying or coordinating the identification of key biodiversity areas across Canada. So what have we done to date? So in a year of concerted effort, we have developed a lot of infrastructure. So we have this management committee, we have Secretariat, we have work teams, we have a website, which I invite you all to visit, which explains really our approach in Canada, as well as some of the tools and the outputs that we've already come up with. We've developed a national KBA standard, which I'll go into in a little bit of detail in a minute, because that's a pretty important part of our program. And then really the basis for all the work is our databases, and our databases rely very heavily on NatureServe data and the NatureServe Canada network and the provincial and territorial conservation data centers. And the quality of the data that has been gathered in this database is just fantastic. We've added to it many other types of data, but the NatureServe data is really, and I'll explain this a bit later too, what is allowing us to move forward very, very quickly with identifying key biodiversity areas. So a second sort of channel of work is regional work on the ground with teams of experts and coordinators working in different places and working specifically with governments and other decision makers at a subnational scale to make sure that the outputs will be used. So we do have a set of regional coordinators, not in every province and territory, but I think we have 6 or 7 at this point. We have NGO and academic partners. So we have a number of postdocs and PhD students who are working in universities across Canada. We've had several workshops, which we find to be a very effective format just for both identifying key biodiversity areas and delineating it with all the expertise in the room, but also for doing some training so people don't know what this tool is. Once people have participated in a workshop, we end up with dozens of new champions for this approach, which is a very important part of the work that we're doing. So now we're replacing workshops with virtual alternatives, which is somewhat effective as well, but it doesn't replace the in-person training that we can do at in-person workshops. Another vein of work is a lot of outreach. So we are building partnerships. Again, I have to, in fact, this part of the work has been heavier than what I had expected at the beginning. We could have at the beginning decided to do more of a desktop analysis, top-down approach, using all the data, using a lot of modeling, and that's a valid approach. But in Canada, I'm quite confident that it wouldn't be as effective as taking some of the work on the ground. But in order to do this, we have to do a lot of outreach, give a lot of talks, do a lot of training sessions, and really reach out to all sorts of partners who may be important to both provide expertise in interpreting data that we have, and also eventually stewarding these sites as well. So to tell you a little bit more about the databases that we're using, so NatureServe Canada is the lead in developing and managing the development of the KBA. We call it the KBA/EBAR database because the development of ecosystem-based automated range maps is a big part of this work as well. And in fact, so are a lot of other products that, because we have all the data put together in this wonderful deep database, we're able to quickly create other data products as well that can help us do KBA assessments. So the KBA EBAR database holds data for all of the identified KBA trigger species under criteria A1 and B1. So that's threatened species and geographically restricted species. The reason that it's harder to have a complete list of, for example, D1 species, which are large aggregations of species, because you don't have ready-made lists of species that are under certain threat levels, for example. So most of the species that we're starting to look at are under these categories because they're the easiest to identify right off the bat. So we have 4 million records in this database. A lot of them are NatureServe and Conservation Data Center records. So a lot of them are element occurrences, which is, as a point at the end there, it's the EO format lends itself really well to KBA delineation because we know exactly what we're getting. It's very well explained. There's a lot of metadata attached to element occurrences, but that so we also have lower quality data as well, or a mix. So sorting through all that data really requires expertise for interpretation as well. But that database is the basis for all of our KBA identification and delineation in Canada. We're also developing range maps and habitat suitability models for scoping key biodiversity area locations. We're doing rapid calculations of area of occupancy, etc. And so the reason that we need the potential to develop all of these data products is that in order to test thresholds in KBAs to see if a KBA meets the threshold or not, you need to have one parameter that you have 2 values for. So that the site value, for example, what's the area of occupancy of a particular endangered species within a site, and you also need then the global area of occupancy to be able to compare those 2 numbers. In some cases, you may have population numbers at the global scale and nothing at the site scale. You might have area of occupancy at the site scale, but not at the global scale. So you need to have some sort of flexibility to adapt your data to be able to test those thresholds. So having a database all together is very useful for that. We use the database also within workshops for delineation. So putting up all the element occurrences and other observations on a screen in a workshop and figuring out what that means, and having it interpreted by experts and who often are able to go and say, hey, yes, so I surveyed that particular spot in the field and that population is no longer there, or it's still in the same quantities as it was 10 years ago, etc. We also, in that database, we store the KBA spatial layers as they are developed. So we also are going to have a second database, which will be the outward-facing database, and this is our national version of what the global partnership is doing. So they have a global database of key biodiversity areas, and we'll have a national one as well. And it builds on the work of Birds Canada because they have already developed an important bird and biodiversity area database, and they have already now reassessed all 550 plus important bird areas under the KBA standard now, and 279 of them will be KBAs at the global scale. And now we're using the database again to do automatic sort of assessments because these sites are already delineated. We can quickly see what other species are found within those boundaries and do they meet KBA criteria, so we can add other taxa to those sites. So I wanted to quickly also touch on the national standard. The global standard in Canada doesn't capture all of our priority biodiversity elements. We have quite a well-developed system for identifying biodiversity priorities in Canada, and that's the EcoCiencia system. And so there was a concern that many of the species in Canada are of national concern, but not necessarily global concern. So the national standard adapts the global KBA standard quite conservatively. So we're not diverging in any major ways, but we're taking the experience of what we've done, for example, to adapt IUCN, the red list, to Canada, which is EcoCiencia, and Dave Fraser has led this adaptation at the national scale, and so the standard at the national scale includes infraspecies, so we're able to assess individual caribou populations, for example, which are extremely distinct in Canada, but under the global standard, we'd be able to only look at them as one species. We test the thresholds against national parameters instead of global parameters. And then for criterion A1, we include species within specific threat categories, EcoCiencia system, and also the NatureServe system, so N1 and N2 species as well. So we're currently testing that. And just to give you an idea of what that adds to our workload, on the left are the global criterion A1 species that could trigger a KBA in Canada, and there's about 682 of them. If we include national threatened species, we have 2,281. It's also interesting to point out here, and I love pointing this out too, that most of the species that are KBA trigger species in Canada are not charismatic megafauna. They are, you know, caddisflies and liverworts. And so there is a huge potential in Canada to bring attention to species that don't usually get a lot of attention. And we're finding that we're identifying key biodiversity areas around obscure plants in wonderful places that exist nowhere else in the world. So I said I was going to come back to this regional approach. We're taking the regional approach for reasons of credibility, legitimacy, and relevance. We have regional coordinators who are trained in KBA methods in the use of the database. They work with local taxonomic and ecosystem experts. They already have their networks, so they know how to do this properly. They know how to, you know, they're better placed to do this work, and they also understand the conservation policy context where they're working than we could at from the top-down perspective. And so at the central sort of secretariat, which is where I'm sort of directing things, the workflows and the protocols and the tools, we're developing all sorts of things and providing support where needed and oversight to make sure that all the guidelines are being followed. And that's provided centrally at WCS Canada. We are doing national scale analyses and using those data sets as well, as I mentioned before, to develop all sorts of tools, which is to scope where KBAs are likely to be, to automate assessments of sites that are already delineated. I mentioned the IBAs before. Also, we can do automatic assessments of existing conservation areas and protected areas, and then to explore alternative methods for identifying KBAs. So we're working on the ecosystem criteria right now with the help of Pat Comer, which is fantastic. And we're needing to do more of a top-down analysis to do the red list assessments and to figure out how the KBA criteria are being met. And then we'll need to narrow it down anyway. I had this little side-by-side schematic there of what you win and lose by doing things site by site versus a systematic sort of data-driven top-down approach. And many countries are taking that systematic data-driven approach, and I think it's valid too. It's a good benchmark. You can do things much more quickly. It's very slow and costly to do things site by site, but what you trade off is that opportunity for buy-in from stakeholders, from governments, etc. And in Canada, that is extremely important. So we are doing it slow and hopefully not too costly. And we're balancing it though by doing some national scale modeling. We should have models of where KBAs are likely to be, but bringing that down to the site scale is still something that needs to be done then. So I'm just going to wrap up here. These are the kinds of initiatives that we're undertaking at the moment. So we've had a great workshop in the Yukon with fantastic experts who were there. We identified something like 26 KBAs there in all over the place. BC, we're just getting started. We've got a great coordinator in place there as well, and we will be adding the ecosystem criteria. In Quebec, we have more of an academic consortium of partners who are working on different approaches to both modeling and identifying site by site. I won't go through all of them, but just to say they're not all regional. So we had a freshwater KBA workshop where we took a national approach and brought in freshwater experts from across the country. We're doing some marine pilots because that hasn't really been done yet before. It looks different in all of these places. You need the data, you need the expertise, but you also need to kind of interpret the guidelines and figure things out in different ways in each place. And that's been really interesting and really fun. And that's, I think, where the global community can really learn from each other. So I'm looking forward to more discussions as people gain more experience to really figure this out. So this is our growing set. The red dots are existing reassessed IBAs that are now KBAs, and we're adding taxa to them. The blue sets are where we've done regional efforts, and those are the set that are going to grow really quickly in the next little while. I'm just going to click through these really quickly. These are just to show you that they look different in different places. These are some of our new KBAs. This is in Trial Island in Vancouver. This is a little polluted river in southern Ontario that has 5 global trigger species. They're all mollusks. And this is in the Arctic where their narwhal and dovekies come together, and we will be identifying at least 2 or 3 KBAs for these species up there. So I'll end there. I hope I didn't take up too much time. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to hear your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ciara. That was such a useful overview, and we're so jealous of Canada for thinking, for investing in this work. I mean, it would be so wonderful if we could get other national governments to invest at the level that Canada has. And hopefully it's thrilling for all of us here to learn about the value of NatureServe data as an input, and the NatureServe Network and our expertise as an input, a key input into this process. So thank you so much. We're going to save questions for the end because I want to make sure that Chris and Pat and also Carmen get a chance to talk about other geographies in the network. So I would like to pass it off promptly to Chris Tracey from Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program and Pat Comer. So Ciara, you stopped sharing. Chris, you want to start sharing, please? And they are going to talk to us about what the road might be ahead for applying in the United States. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody, this is Pat Comer. And so Chris and I are gonna tag team on this, and Chris is gonna advance slides. So I'll go first, and part of what we wanted to do was we'll kind of dig in a little bit further so you can get a feel for some of the mechanics of how KBAs start to get identified. We'll actually emphasize ecosystem, some of the ecosystem criteria, and actually, as Ciara alluded to, I'm working on the Canadian part of the Canadian effort as it relates to ecosystems. So I'll use some example material from there, but then we'll sort of shift to the United States and think about, Chris will talk more specifically about some places in Pennsylvania. Just to, mainly we just want to collectively think together about what might be some pathways forward to where we might see ourselves organizing this kind of effort within the United States. So go ahead and advance the slide. So first, just to dig in one level of the criteria as it relates to ecosystems, you'll see, so threatened ecosystems fall under A2. The critical things you need to understand about these is that you had to understand and had gone through a red list process, sort of the equivalent of our global ranks, to determine whether or not you had a critically endangered or endangered ecosystem. What was the status score of that ecosystem type versus a vulnerable ecosystem type. And then it would be that proportion, a given place has to contain greater than some proportion of the range-wide extent. So as Ciara laid that out as examples for species, the same basic mechanics apply to ecosystems for the threatened ecosystem criteria. And under geographically restricted, you could think of it in very similar ways. It's just much more of it. You need to be talking about an ecosystem type that is highly concentrated within a fairly small area, and therefore a site that has more than 20% of its global extent would then trigger KBA identification. So go ahead and advance the next slide. So we've been working on red listing ecosystems for the recent number of years, and we're accumulating this information. So we're starting to paint that bigger picture that really relates to our global ranks, as well as then the IUCN red list of ecosystem. And this is really at a continental scale. This is the most sort of concentrated set of information. We're using our terrestrial ecological system classification as sort of the basis of this, because we have a mapped information comprehensively across the board to do this. And so what you're seeing here is an initial outputs of our analyses. We could start to see just proportions of the landscape that today likely support either critically endangered, or vulnerable types of ecosystems. And so what we're doing then in the Canadian prairies is where we're working on things right now. You can go to the next slide. Is we're digging in, actually updating some of that mapped information more locally, and then asking these basic questions about how much is there, what's its current extent, what's its overall status. That leads us to that percentage requirement for KBA identification. And in this case, we're using 100 square kilometer hexagon units as sort of spatial units to just organize this information. And it gives you a feel for just how many clusters of hexagons would we need for a given location that supports these different ecosystem types to start to trigger KBA identification under A2. If it was B4, go ahead and advance to slide 1. So that's, again, that geographically restricted sense. We can then ask ourselves, actually, do we cross a 20% sort of threshold for the range-wide extent? And in this case, I'll show you in fact, we actually are crossing those two different kinds of thresholds, both the A2 and the B4 in a couple of instances in the Canadian prairies. So you can go to the next slide. Just to give you a feel for kind of the mechanics of this is that we have the spatial distribution, underlying raster spatial data for these distributions. We come into it understanding, where or updating our knowledge about that red list status. And then we're populating these hexagons in terms of that proportion of their threshold. And what you can see in this sense is just based on the colors, you can start to get a feel for areas, hexagons, where they're starting to emerge, where there's some potential that you could be crossing those thresholds. And so this is an important point, is that, simply the presence of a given threatened or endangered, critically endangered ecosystem or species does not trigger KBA identification. No, you have to have that proportional extent. And so you could have many that just by the nature of their current distribution, they simply do not qualify. So go ahead to the next slide. This is sort of moving over to the east here, just getting into more of a cluster here in Manitoba of several different ecosystem types. And this is sort of the preliminary, processing of our distribution data for different types, applying our knowledge of those area thresholds to initially look at, okay, do we have some potential of actually triggering KBA status with a cluster of hexagons? So then go to the next slide. And by integrating that information with a lot of understanding of what's going on the ground, we could then pick and choose a bit to initially identify clusters of these hexagon areas that are likely to, therefore trigger KBA status. And so that's the initial set. And it's important to understand the difference between identification, which is this broader, pointing to that landscape. We could say it is, in this case, we're taking a bit of a top-down approach. And then delineation is where you go to a finer level of detail to actually arrive at a conclusion about what is actually the KBA boundary. And so go ahead and advance the slide. So thinking about this with sort of spatial units of this sort, NatureServe, we are in the process of building out NatureServe Explorer, and one of the aspects of what we're working on right now, and we'll be hopefully advancing quite a bit over the next year, is a lot of the capabilities for representation of spatial distributions of biodiversity, be they species or ecosystems. And what we'll start to see is that ability of, let's just say, in the free Explorer website, you'll be able to use things like let's say this 49 square mile hexagon as a common spatial frame to simply represent biodiversity. And so the user could get online and query that and understand there's something that is contained there, okay? And so we're already aiming to develop spatial information that represents both species and ecosystem data at several different levels of these hexagon spatial units. And this could be something we want to take forward and utilize in the context of, let's say, a national level for KBA identification. Go to the next slide. One of those decisions we'll be making is this utilization of the habitat suitability models that have been recently generated for many of the at-risk taxa. Many of these taxa will from a species standpoint will be meeting, be trigger species for KBA identification. And so we do have an opportunity to organize both the ecosystem and spatial and species data from a spatial standpoint within these sort of hexagonal units to do a bit of that organization of information to really see what our many different possible options could be for identifying KBAs. So go to the next slide. We could start to think about some possible approaches that on the one hand, there are some top-down sort of identification where we utilize we're populating the content that we want to do for purposes like use on Explorer Pro anyway. And then there are tools, some people might be familiar with tools like MarkSan, which is a spatial optimization software that's used in conservation planning. And I've used it many times over the last 20, 25 years. And one of the aspects and requirements that you can impose within a MarkSan set, it would take those hexagons, and then there's a minimum area requirement. You could basically apply that minimum area threshold, and it will help you identify those clusters of those hexagonal units that would cross those KBA identification thresholds. So you could see there's a real possibilities to utilize our data in this sort of a mechanical way, so to speak, but it's to help us cope with just the huge amount of distribution information for the many different species and ecosystems that are really, that can trigger KBAs. We would then take a bottom-up approach and combine that with all of this local expertise, integration of the other criteria, the C and D criteria for KBA identification, and then actually go into delineation. So, we're at very early stages here in the United States. We're learning a lot from the great Canadian experience right now. And I think over time, we need to be, talking about this more. There are different options for us to devise a process that really maximizes the strengths of our data and our expertise across the network in the United States. And so with that, I'll just pass this to Chris. You want to sort of take that to the next level and think about KBA delineation.
Right, yeah. Well, thanks, Pat. Yeah, so in thinking about the KBA delineation process, so Pat outlined this approach where we could go and identify fairly quickly some potential KBAs across the nation, but we're going to have to rely on our local program expertise to go and really turn those into official KBA sites. Just some background in the language we're using for KBAs, a site, just a geographic area was defined ecology. But another concept that really comes into the KBA delineation is this idea of manageability. Can we do some sort of effective management for those species on that site within this designated KBA? We'll come back to that later, but just keep that in mind as we move forward. So for this example, we're going to look at one ecological system, our Eastern Serpentine Woodlands. This is a system that is predominantly occurring in a very narrow band along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border in southwest Pennsylvania, kind of just above the Baltimore area. And it's really characterized by this light green bedrock that's overlain by these really thin soils. It's kind of a toxic environment with lots of nickel, chromium, some other metals in them. The Red List of Ecosystems classifies this as critically endangered. There's not much of it in the world. And for this example, we're going to focus on these Goat Hill Serpentine Barrens. You can see some pictures of them here, including some active management where these are a fire management system that do receive prescribed fire. Looking at the recent land fire update maps, you can see here's southwest Pennsylvania. Here's the Susquehanna River, for those who know, and these kind of blue polygons on the map here, and here are what's currently mapped as Serpentine Woodland right now. And we're going to focus on this Goat Hill site, which is right over here. So here's what it looks like from an aerial photograph, literally right on the border here. You can see it's kind of an agricultural, slightly suburban matrix. This is right outside of Philadelphia. It's been rapidly growing for a long time. Lots of land conversion, and really not much of this left overall. This area, for us in Pennsylvania, this area is pretty important. Here's just the point reps from our bioinformatics database for the area. There's over 84 EOs just in this view before. So when we talk about important areas for conservation in Pennsylvania, this is always one of the ones that comes to the top. And if we were to take the kind of this bottom-up approach to identifying ecological hotspots across the country, if you asked us, this would probably be a site like, oh, Serpentine Barrens, they're pretty important. So, but in thinking about what triggers a KBA, there's these criteria. Pat covered the species criteria. Ciara talked about much of the other factors as well. But right now, let's pretty much focus on the species criteria. So criteria A1 is threatened species, and the site holds one or more of the following of the species that's critically endangered are endangered. A certain percentage. If it's a vulnerable species, it's slightly more, and then a couple other factors that really begin to get at species that are undergoing a rapid decline in their population numbers. Since most of the people on this call are probably heritage related, you're seeing that we are using the red list definitions for rarity here. The global standard for KBA identification has been built around that, but there is a provision to go and use other ranking systems, most notably the NatureServe, global impairment system. So a G1 is pretty much equivalent to critically endangered or endangered. G2 is vulnerable under the current definitions. So looking at what we have in terms of data, this is some of the data we have from biotics, that all the heritage programs tend to collect something similar. We have 4 potential species in here. One is, 3 species and one community or system. So, one of our, we do have the frosted elfin butterfly that occurs here. We have an endemic rarity of a chickweed that we think is pretty important. It's the goat-tailed chickweed. It only occurs on this site, as far as we know. It's a species that we think is pretty globally important, but if you read the criteria, and I think Ciara mentioned this, that infrataxa don't qualify under the global standard for KBA, so that's one we're not really going to consider. And then we also have the serpentine aster, Symphyiotrichum depaupertatum, which is a near endemic aster to the Serpentine Barrens, the North Carolina, down North Carolina. Was found on a diabase glade as well, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, it's pretty much confined to this small area of, across Pennsylvania and Maryland. As we move into looking at trigger species, at these trigger species that would go and potentially cause a KBA delineation, the first one is this eastern serpentine woodland. This is red listed, as we mentioned before. There's a threshold for how much area we need to qualify under criteria A2, which is imperil the ecosystems or threatened ecosystems, and that would be 5% or 34 acres. We have at least 207 acres. Our mapped element occurrence for this is somewhere in 414 acres. According to the land fire mapping right now, there's 672 hectares. Some of these numbers may be slightly off in terms of the actual extent of it. But the short story for this is both of those are suitable species that could be included within the KBA. So the serpentine aster, this is a G2 species with
Chris,
sorry.
Can I just quickly interrupt? I think we need to hit like the highlights because we're really running out of time, and I want to make sure that Carmen goes and we're a little. Yeah, thank you. If you could just hit the highlights. Thank you very much.
So going through this, serpentine aster goes and reaches that KBA criteria. The frosted elfin does not. There's just not enough of there. We saw 3 individuals. There are some interesting things that we have to get into deeper here eventually about like how we maintain data. We have our best population estimate for the aster was 1,000 stems across several locations. So getting into delineation here, we go and we can look at protected land. Getting back to this idea of manageability, we have only so much land, so much control over the land. In the end, we'd have a KBA that looks something like this. And taking this information, we have to reconcile. One thing we need to do as a network is start to reconcile with our National Heritage Program site layers. So we maintain a database of sites. About half the other programs do as well. This is our current site for the Goat Hill area. How do these combine? And can we use them as part of our heritage products? So just in summary here, I'm skipping ahead of some. Our investments in the red listed ecosystems, MOBI improvements, NatureServe Explorer. We have this really cool, great way of identifying KBAs from the top down, and then using our expert knowledge from the programs, we can really review these and look at delineating really high quality KBAs across the country. That I can end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris and Pat. I really like the idea of that top-down, bottom-up framework, and which highlights the strength of our data and our network. So please, participants, we encourage you to put any questions in the chat box because we will definitely not have time for questions at the end of this. But we do want to move now to Latin America and hear from Dr. Josse about what is happening with KBAs in the tropical Andes. Carmen, over to you, please.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Great. We are seeing your screen.
Okay. Let me see, how can I go to my first slide? Sorry.
Oops. That ended the show.
That is weird. How about now? Are you?
So try to reshare your screen again, the main PowerPoint screen.
Okay.
And okay, it looks like it's coming back on now, Carmen. We are seeing, not the full, we're seeing the panel on the side.
On the presentation?
The thumbnails on the side, but I think it's okay.
No, wait a second.
If you have two screens, sometimes it can, okay, that's great.
Okay, thank you, Healy.
Of course.
And good afternoon, everyone. So my talk, and thank you for the invitation to this session. My talk is not about the delineation of KBAs. I am going to talk about a process that we just have been following basically in Ecuador, in the tropical Andes of Ecuador, to integrate a new set of data of listed species that, of course, triggered also new KBAs. And because of that new data or information that was produced by IUCN, by a team of IUCN for the tropical Andes as a whole, we were asked that for the case of Ecuador, we use that new data to do the updating of the priority setting of the KBAs of the tropical Andes in Ecuador. So let me go back in time a bit, and it means to go also back in time to when I was still part of the NatureServe team. And let me move this panel, which is giving me a hard time. Okay. So in 2015, NatureServe delivered to the CEPF, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, what is called the ecosystem profile for the tropical Andes hotspot. Okay, so on the left you have a map of what means or what covers the tropical Andes hotspot. Is an almost 1.5 million square kilometer area, and of course strongly populated as well. And the objective of the profile of that document is to give a clear picture and updated picture of the state of the hotspot and the best ways forward to protecting the vulnerable biodiversity in the hotspot, at the same time improving the livelihoods of local communities. And because all of this information is key for the CEPF, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, investment in the area. So the CEPF takes on periods, of investment in the different hotspots, biodiversity hotspots of around the globe. So when we did this in 2015 for the tropical Andes, we came up with, of course, in that case at that time, for the tropical Andes, there were already a very large number of KBAs identified. Most of them, I would say, were IBAs, important dirt areas, or ACE sites, sites for the Alliance of Zero Extension. So not only those two types of important biodiversity areas, but mostly. So in any case, when we did all that profile assessment for the tropical Andes, we needed to analyze the conservation outcomes at the level of KBAs and also of species. In the case of KBAs, you have the numbers there for the different countries of the region. For Ecuador, we had 79 KBAs, and that means almost 4 million hectares in the country, and 35% of the hotspot of the hotspot area inside the country, which is basically the Andean region. Okay, so as part of that profiling exercise, we came up with, among all those hundreds of KBAs, with 36 KBAs that were the priority ones. And why is that important? Because basically for CEPF, they just have limited resources to be invested in the region for conservation projects for the civil society organizations, and so we needed to come up with the most important ones and the ones that would have also the enabling conditions to have impact as a result of those investments. So 11 of those 36 KBAs identified as priority KBAs for investment were in Ecuador, right? Mostly in the northern part and also in the southeast of the country. So this time around, what we have been working on is, because we got these new locality and distribution polygons for reptile and plant species, we needed to integrate that new data into the previous biodiversity analysis that we did for the whole tropical Andes in Ecuador, right? And for the KBA. So basically, new red listed species were focused on endemic species from Ecuador and distributed in the Andean region. 91 were plant species and 58 were reptile species. This was also this updating of the red lists of plant and reptile groups was identified as one of the things that was needed for addressing more of the biodiversity of the hotspot, because mostly when all of those KBAs were delineated for the region, as I said, it was based mostly on birds and amphibians, of course. So in this case, with those 91 plant species and 58 reptile species, those also triggered the delineation of 15 new KBAs. And this is only for Ecuador, though the red listing of those plants and reptile groups were done for all of the tropical Andes hotspot. So this is important because at some point in the other countries, when the profile begins to be updated for the whole hotspot, they will also need to use similar process analysis processes as we have done. So we basically use the locality and distribution polygons for these species, and of course their red list category. And this was added to all the previous analysis of vertebrates that we did for the profile in 2015. And that together would give an updated vision of the biological importance of the KBAs, determined by the presence of threatened species, their status on the IUCN Red List, and also an irreplaceability index, which the latter, this last criterion, was the way we found, to go to assess the biological priority of these enormous amounts of KBAs that we had in the region. So for the CEPF prioritization process of KBAs, the number one criterion is the biological importance of the KBA. And so basically, the way we approached the assessment of that biological importance was through a relative biodiversity value, was through assessing and assigning a relative biodiversity value to the sites. So we did that back in 2015, and this time around, because we had new species data to add to the analysis, to the spatial analysis for these KBAs, we basically needed to go through an assessment or a relative biodiversity value scoring of all of the sites. And that included the 11 priority sites or KBAs identified back then. Also the 64 no priority KBAs that are part of the, as you can see here on the right map of the KBAs in the Andes of Ecuador. And also for the 15 new candidate KBAs. And basically,
Carmen?
yes?
Carmen, just because it's the top of the hour, do you think we could ask you to like hit the high points? And thank you for those of you who are able to stay with us as we like kind of try to hit the main highlights and wrap it up. And I'm sorry for the time pressure, Carmen.
It's okay. So basically, I think what is important here is to, and as I said, it's because when we did the profile in 2015, we used a very spatial-driven analysis for the whole hotspot, for the whole tropical Andes hotspot, based on the red list category of the species and the size or the extent of the distribution of those species. So with that, we assigned an irreplaceability value at the level of the species, and then we used that using a grid of hexagons to also give each of these hexagons a site, in this case, a site irreplaceability index. And with that, we were able to come up with these relative values of biodiversity across the whole tropical Andes region, and based on that, an overlap and further analysis with the KBA. So we were able to also use this kind of site irreplaceability index to value the relative biodiversity value, or assign a relative biodiversity value to the KBAs. And that is what we have been doing. Then we have or established a threshold of, in this range of 0 to 1 normalized values of biodiversity, which were the really important ones in assigning a threshold. We got this kind of map of biodiversity value at the level of sites, which we can see on the right side. And from there, it is possible to have a relative biodiversity value of each of the KBAs. As I said, we work with 80 plus KBAs for Ecuador this time, and this basically is a table that shows those values, and then here is the value on the right hand side and of the table, and so we know now which are the most important ones. And then this goes to another set of criteria. These sites, these KBAs, go through the assessment of 8 other criteria, which are basically related with, as I said, with the enabling condition, the threat condition, and all of that for these sites. And that is something that we do in a setting of workshops with experts and people who work in those areas. And so we are approaching the end of this process, and we will, with this, have a new set of priority KBAs for investment in the Ecuadorian Andes. I think the one thing that I would like to highlight about this is that because a new period of investment in tropical Andes KBAs is coming very soon. I'm talking about the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund investment. And this same process will be replicated for the other countries in the hotspot. So I think I can wrap up with that. But I just want to say also that in the process and in these workshops, we have been able to see how important and how urgent is the update of the KBAs for this region in general. I think that most of those KBAs that we worked with in 2015 are still, the same, and the delineation is the same. And of course, listening to all the you said of standards of the KBA partnership and what you guys are doing in North America. I think it is really important as well to have an opportunity to work in the updating of the KBA delineation in general in this side of the world. Thank you.
Carmen, thank you so much. I apologize to all the people that are still hanging in there for going over time. We will wrap it up. We have answered a few questions in the question box. We do hope that you are sort of convinced that KBAs are something that uniquely the NatureServe Network, our data, our network, our expertise are extremely well positioned to advance throughout our entire geography of the Americas, with Canada leading the way. And the important work of our Latin America partners, and so many KBAs left to identify and delineate that we can have a unique contribution to this globally significant biodiversity information product. So with that, I will wrap it up. I don't know, Allison, if you have any final words, and thank you again to everyone for joining us this afternoon, and especially to Ciara, who had to leave already, to Chris and Pat, and to Carmen for their presentations. Allison?
All right, thank you. Yes, and thanks to everyone who joined, and you'll be able to find this recording on our website. So thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ciao, gracias. Bye, everyone.